Assassin's Creed needs to change, and my last video was very poorly understood, and a lot of people actually just came in to drop a dislike without even really seeing what I was saying, thinking that I was going to talk shit about the game, when in reality, it couldn't be further from the truth, because if anything, everything I was saying there was from somebody who's really passionate about the games. I love these games, or grew up with these games, and I want them to thrive and keep going on into the future. That's why I made that video to begin with. But since a lot of people were triggered by the title of that video, I decided to make a second one explaining more calmly and less passionately as to why Assassin's Creed needs to change and why the story is now basically dead. So what this is a 5-act story arc. It's not the best model to show how stories work, but it's the one that most films, TV shows, and games tend to use. So let's go over it really quickly. The first act is the norm, or the setting, the theme, or the background, or whatever you want to call it. All it is where you establish the world in which your story takes place. Now, between the first act and the second act is when stuff starts to actually happen, and that's when you get to your second act, which is your catalyst. Your catalyst is when your hero finally decides to do something about the issues that are happening in his world. Now, between the second and the third act is where the hero goes on the hero's journey, starts to learn new things, starts to find out who the bad guy is, and essentially start moving over towards the climax. The climax is the climax of the confrontation where the hero and the villain finally face off, after which things start to slow down again. As the problems start to get resolved, whether the hero wins or whatever the case may be, it becomes more of an act of filling the plot holes and answering any unanswered questions from the previous act. Finally, you have the final image, and your final image is essentially the new world after your hero's journey is complete and after you've come to your new goal. Now, whenever you get to your final image, that is where your story should end. And the final image in Assassin's Creed was Assassin's Creed 3. So here's the problem with the games carrying on the same story after Assassin's Creed 3. Essentially, the game's already been completed. The story's been told. The overarching story has come to a finale. Except it didn't, because as Ubisoft starts to stretch out the games, the new Assassin's Creed games have a very low stake. They do have some fluctuations, as every single game has its own narrative and stakes and arc, but overall they're not really connected together, and each one doesn't really add or pile up onto the other one to create a very big overarching story like the original 5 Assassin's Creed games did. Now, if Ubisoft wants to carry on the same Assassin's Creed storyline, they have really got one of two options. The first one is to go back and raise the stakes and go back to the climax, but then what that does is essentially invalidate every game that came before, because whatever happened here was meaningless if we go back to another climax of a similar scale or even a larger scale, because it means that the sacrifices made by Desmond, the journey of Ezio, the journey of Altair and the truths that he found, and Connor, essentially all that becomes pointless because they basically all did all that for nothing. And you definitely don't want to do that. You don't want to invalidate the entire journey by going back and saying, well, he didn't really stop the end of the world, there's going to be another end of the world. Well, that makes all the first 5 games essentially irrelevant. Or the second option that Ubisoft have is to stay at a lower stake and basically carry on, which is what they're doing right now, which is more focusing on the gameplay mechanics and kind of throwing about a story here and there and making little arcs, but not really creating an overarching plot, so to speak of. So what's the solution? Easy. A new detached story arc, which respects the original games, maintains itself in the same universe, but tells a brand new story in that same universe. Think of how the Mandalorian coexists in the Star Wars universe, and that's basically what I'm getting at here. So what can they do with a new story arc? Well, there are two options again. The first option is to create a much larger scale stake. Basically, something new has to threaten the world, something even bigger than the solar flare, and it has to be really catastrophic if it happens. Ideally, it should be something that's much bigger than Assassins or Templars. Maybe it's even something that they have to work together against and put aside their differences, because it's such a horrible thing that if they don't band together, the result of that particular event happening will be much worse than either party winning. And probably most importantly, it really needs to dwarf the freedom versus chaos problem that's going on right now in the franchise by making a much more catastrophic event be the thing that they're trying to avoid. Now, the second option is to actually shrink down the stakes and make it a much more personal and intimate thing that is at stake here. That's not as much world ending for everybody as it is world ending for our character. Maybe it's their son, maybe it's their wife, maybe it's their husband, whoever it may be, somebody who's a loved one, family member, or something much, much more personal. A really great example of a game that does this by shrinking the stakes down but at the same time raising them would be the new God of War, which the stakes are now just your son. So it's not about killing the gods and whatever anymore. It's about protecting your son, but at the same time, because that's a lot more personal, that's a lot more emotional for your character, we become much more invested in that story, and we can actually make that stake seem a lot higher than it actually is. Plus, it gives us a much better connection to the character and all the stories being told around them. But listen, either way, these options, both of them require a detached story, and Assassin's Creed really needs to let go of the old, really dead story, which is what I was talking about in the last video, and start a new plot within the same universe. Otherwise, the games are going to get really fucking stale, and it's a limitation on the writers, it's a limitation of where they can go, and really it doesn't add anything to it. It doesn't actually make people care. A lot of comments were actually saying in my previous video that, oh, I don't even care about the story, I just come for the gameplay. that just shows that the story is not that great. If the story was good, you would care. Now, the games are mechanically sound, but I tell you what, the stories could really use a lot of work. But anyway, tell me what you think in the comments below, and if you like what I'm doing over here on this channel, make sure to hit subscribe, and if you want to see what the last video was about, go ahead and watch that here. And if you can't find the comments, they've moved them up underneath the video now. I really hate it. I made a whole video on that over here, and yeah, so let's see what Valhalla goes like.